This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast, where life is indeed like a dream, but it's an awkward one, and Mars bats are involved. I'm your host, Puka, and I am joined by Fetch. Greetings, Fetch.
Hello, Puka. This is the second edition of Fetch that you're talking to. I'm new, improved, and have questionable decisions about the updates to my systems.
Shouldn't you be more like the 1.5th version for this one, or something?
I think that if you look at my changelog history, it's actually unclear which version of me you just downloaded.
Since we are recording this on Pi Day, perhaps 1.pi.
Yes, I'm 1.pi Fetch. Nice to meet you.
There you go. So yes, on that theme, today we are kinda, sorta, maybe partly moving out of first edition nWoD, but not quite into Chronicles of Darkness because the way that this unfolded is a bit convoluted. So I'd like to cast our minds back in time to 2013 when the Icelandic overlords CCP shuttered the publishing arm of White Wolf, whose IP they had bought in order to turn into a video game that withered on the vine. And at this point, Onyx Path had fully broken away, licensing the old World of Darkness games in the wake of V20's hugely successful crowdfunding campaign. So that line was continuing. Werewolf 20 was on the way with others in the works. And meanwhile, the steady torrent of books for the new World of Darkness had largely dried up, apart from some occasional SAS adventures and fiction stuff. And it's not like CCP was doing anything with those, and it had been nearly a decade since that universe was launched, so maybe it was time for an update. I need you to confirm whether I have this correct. So,
I'll do my best.
Onyx Path released the God-Machine Chronicle, which is a pre-made world-spanning chronicle thing, but the important part was the back half of the book, which overhauled the core system. Or I guess the whole book was important, but for our purposes today, that part of the book with the rules was released separately as a free download, which was the God-Machine rules update. Vampire then got a new core book called, at first, the Strix Chronicle, which overhauled that game's rules to fit more in line with the God-Machine rules update, until the Onyx Path team wised up and just said, no, it's just the second edition. Then Werewolf the Forsaken got that update, Demon the Descent appeared somewhere in the middle of all that, and then in 2015, the God-Machine book got re-expanded and rearranged into the full base core book for New World of Darkness, the second edition, hereafter referred to as Chronicles of Darkness. And the original is no longer available for purchase, apparently, vanished like dust in the wind. The other games got second editions of their own, one by one. In parallel with that, Onyx Path released the Dark Eras, one-off historical settings featuring one or more of the games, some of them in the first edition, but meant to be used with the God-Machine update, some of them in their second edition. I think that pretty much covers the evolution. Have I missed anything?
3 points of correction on this one. 2 of them are kind of minor. I'm showing that the copyright date for Chronicles of Darkness as a full book instead of the rules update is 2016, not 2015, according to its page. And curiously, I'm just now noticing it. That same credits page says the book was originally titled The World of Darkness, 2nd edition, which Onyx Path, to my understanding, wanted to release a 2nd edition for some time, in fact. However, they had been denied permission to do that by CCP. So they released this rules update and, well, I think first they did the Strix Chronicles for Vampire the Requiem. And they said, This is not a 2nd edition of Requiem, it's just adding some setting material because people often complained that the toolbox approach did not give them enough to develop their own setting. Well, here's a chronicle for you. It's the Strix Chronicle. And then they did likewise with the core World of Darkness, adding in the God-Machine as an element. Although I say adding, I must emphasize that the God-Machine was not new. It was just a snippet from the first edition core book that people fell in love with and worked its way into various books of the first edition. Not just core Blue Book. I believe that several of the other game lines referenced it. And so they're like, yeah, okay, let's just make that its whole thing. This becomes much more important throughout the second edition game line. In fact, the God Machine becomes a defining characteristic that people will rightly or questionably decide to work into a lot of the other game lines. Puka, as you might well know, as I'm sure you know, in fact, once people hooked into the Weaver, the Wyrm, and the Wild in World of Darkness, everybody just ran with that and said that's how the universe actually works for all of the game lines, much to the frustration of anybody who's reading Changeling 20th and going, "Oh, what are all these Foul Lane references to the Weaver? What do these matter? Why is this a thing? What does this have to do with Changeling cosmology?"
Yeah, I remember when the Dauntean could summon actual, like, Weaver spirits.
What?
That was a thing.
What?
Yeah, back in the day.
Incredible. Final point on this. They did this update, and then eventually, I think it was after they switched to Paradox, they got the go ahead to officially release a second edition. And then they said, yeah, we're doing a second edition. We just couldn't call it that. However, as part of that update, I think it was Paradox that said, it's cool for you to do a second edition. However, you do need to rename the game line to avoid confusion with the original World of Darkness brand, presumably because of their own plans for releasing the 5th edition of the game line.
Well, and you're pointing to the 2016 publication date on the Chronicles of Darkness book, and I'm wondering if that was kind of the second go-around. Like maybe there was World of Darkness 2nd edition released in 2015, and then they did an updated version or something.
That's what I'm thinking too.
Yeah. But going through this, so for the sake of this episode and making sense of this historical mishmash, we are basing our read-through primarily on the God-Machine rules update rather than the Chronicles of Darkness core book proper. And I think by doing that, as we go into dark eras after this, we should be pretty covered, right?
There will be a few addenda I have from the Chronicles of Darkness book to mention. They added some more material when that came out.
Oh, yeah.
And I have a couple general comments, but yes, for readers who are most familiar with first edition of the book, I do recommend that you just look at the rules update to get an impression of what has changed. I think that will serve you well.
I mean, there are some pretty significant departures from the first edition rule set, but some of them are also fairly minor tweaks. And some of those changes do shift the fundamental feel of the game. I'm relying on your expertise to suss that out more, but it does still have the feel that I think carries through from one edition to the next.
And some of them are just clarifications of the text or elaborations.
Yeah, and some fiction bits mixed in for flavor. All right, anything else before we start flipping pages? Because this is once again a dense chomper that we're going to have to crank through like cranking people.
Let's start by going over that cover. You know, this may have been the same cover they used for the actual God-Machine book, which would explain why it goes so hard, but I love it.
It's 6 flags over Jellyfish Illuminati Angel.
That Jellyfish Illuminati Angel stares into your soul, and I love it.
Yeah. Fun fact, it's actually a photo, just kind of with some filters applied.
I ask that a lot with these books.
Yeah. So this was written by Dave Brookshaw, David A. Hill Jr., Daniel Lauzon, John Newman, John Sneed, Stu Wilson, Philomena Young, and Eric Zawadzki. Quite a team. And there's some playtesters, which is good to see. And we get this weird art of like an H.R. Geiger spider baby with a lamprey mouth following a story about a curious life-draining pet, which I don't know if the art is supposed to go directly with this, but suitably creepy. That said, I feel like after Grim Fears, we've seen so many life-stealing pet monsters. I was like, yeah, another one. But it's good.
The story that goes with it is one of the few that I never forget.
Mm-hmm.
It's sad, it's somehow slow, wonderfully slow, and terrifying despite being only a single page. Among the better fiction we get out of this. And yes, I'm sure this is meant to be Angel because it has the needle-sharp teeth that are described in the story.
And I suppose even though the God-Machine isn't directly referenced here as it is with the other fiction, this is like a taste of that sort of a biomechanical, mind-altering horror thing.
Notice the mechanical legs and also the fact that it's named Angel, 100% a reference.
Yeah. So getting into the meat of the book. All right. This is purely just rules with some setting fluff kind of worked in, so bear with us. First chunk of updates that we're going to get center around character building, I would say. And we start with two simple tweaks. First, trait cost adjustments, pretty straightforward. The fifth dot of an attribute, skill, or merit no longer costs double. And a clarification on specialties. You can only purchase a given instance of a specialty once, though multiple specialties can be applied to a single trait roll, both of which seem fine.
Yes, I think that it's better to just let people buy a fifth dot if they really want a fifth dot in it. You're already action heroes in World of Darkness, just lean into it. And having multiple specialties, it's cool. I like it when players try to come up with cool specialties to apply to situations.
Yeah. Then a somewhat larger change, we get aspirations. So this is pretty straightforward. You choose 3 goals, short-term or long-term, depending on the structure of the chronicle, maybe a mix, probably no more than 1 long-term, that reflect your character. So short-term, picking a couple favorites from the examples they have here might be things like meet a ghost or put myself into mortal danger, while long-term might be bring an end to the chosen of Mammon or show the world that fairies are real. Fundamentally, they should be things to do, not things to avoid doing. They suggest that you try to aim to fulfill at least one of these each session. That's going to tie into experience, which we'll get to in a bit. The book also offers some flexibility to swap them out if an aspiration isn't working. But more importantly, this highlights it's kind of a built-in tool for players to get aligned with the storyteller and with each other on the arc they envision for their characters. It's a solid idea, one which we later see in the Trinity Continuum, one which is reflected in V5 by the ambition and desire pieces, and of course in lots of other role-playing games. And it's one of those, I guess, pieces of character building which, frankly, people have and should have always been doing anyway, just formalized. So I'm into it. How about you?
Aspirations are fantastic in principle, but much more difficult in execution. Fun fact, once we get to Chronicles of Darkness and all of the second edition game lines, it gets formalized as you pick 2 short-term aspirations and 1 long-term aspiration that could take an entire story or longer to see through. I may be missing this, but I am not seeing another fun note they added in Chronicles, which is that you can choose aspirations for your character that they do not want. Like, you could say, I want my character to lose a fight, and that is a perfectly acceptable and delightful aspiration. The problem with aspirations is, in my experience, players forget about them frequently. If you do not remind them at the beginning of every session, they will forget that they exist. They may also forget to look at them during the course of a session. They also have a hard time with fulfilling them. I've done sessions where I have set very clear expectations about what I think is going to happen, and they do not happen because events do not play out the way that players expected, or because we just do not get to everything that we had hoped to for that session. So you really, really have to, and I'm not blaming the players for that. It's just the way the game goes. And I think that means that this system could use a different take. I've done my best to make it work, but I'm not terribly fond of the execution, I'm afraid.
Well, storytellers also have to pay attention to them as well, because they are players telling you directly the story they want their characters to follow, and it is to some extent incumbent on the storyteller to integrate that. But yeah, I know that I've always kind of had the experience of I have 2 short-term aspirations. One of them gets changed out every single session. The other one becomes a long-term aspiration by default because it never gets fulfilled. So
one of my strengths as a storyteller is, unfortunately, is not being able to keep track of all of the widgets for the players. So I have a hard time keeping track of aspirations, virtues, and vices, and the other traits on the player's sheet. It is a lot when you are running a game session, and it is virtuous if you are able to keep track of all of that. But be aware, storytellers, that while you should try to keep track of these things, it will be very difficult unless you are keeping notes at the beginning of every session and looking at them constantly as you are going through, while also running your adventure. It's a lot of weight.
Or if you have a sticky note on your storyteller screen. Anyway, next up, we have Virtue and Vice, which the Chronicles book characterizes as anchors. In the first edition, we had the set lists inspired by theological virtues and deadly sins, but here it's a little more open-ended. You just choose adjectives like honest or peaceful, arrogant or cowardly. Conceptually speaking, they otherwise feel pretty much the same as before, allowing you to regain willpower, all of it with a virtue, 1 point with a vice, in a situation that you hash out with the storyteller. And there's a nice sidebar in here about the importance of willpower as a resource and as a reflection of the game's genre, with the way that it kind of gets spent and regained. Virtues and vices don't directly reflect morality because, as mentioned, sometimes people do immoral things for seemingly virtuous reasons. They can be changed out like aspirations, but under more specific circumstances, such as, hey, becoming a supernatural creature. There are also 2 merits, virtuous and vice-ridden, which allow you to choose 2 virtues or vices, respectively. I'm okay with the open-endedness here, although I think there are actually way more examples given in this rules update than in the Chronicles core book, so that might benefit new players more. So do you see any pitfalls with this change, or any of the other sort of tweaks that they made to the system here? I think overall it's a good change, but...
Yes, and I have an addendum to this. The Virtue Vice system gets used in all of the game lines for 2nd edition. However, all of them, I think except for Hunter, for obvious reasons, do a twist on it. So Changelings have Needle and Thread, which we'll discuss in more detail later, but that amounts to what is the foundational idea of you that you use to keep yourself sane, and what is the through line, your narrative story. Spooky. I do love the concept of opening up virtues and vices. I said as much during our Mirrors episode. The problem, which I think I also mentioned there, is more to do with virtue and vice itself. That is to say that players have a hard time remembering to use it, and I, as a storyteller, have a hard time reminding them to use it. Which means that despite it being the primary way you recover willpower, we've wound up in a lot of situations where I and my players are all scrambling to find some excuse to give them more willpower for in a scene.
Let me ask you, do you ever, something that I end up doing is kind of sometimes giving retroactive, like people say, oh, shit, I'm down to 1 willpower, and they look at their... We should point out here also, we are looking at the mortal-focused rule set. So yes, all of the games will kind of layer on top of this in different ways. This is, if you want to run a purely mortal game, this is all you need. But, they'll look at their virtue, vice, needle, thread, whatever, and say, oh, 2 scenes ago, I did this thing. Does that qualify? And I'll say, yeah, okay, take a willpower retroactively for that.
Absolutely, because none of us want to just say... You can have an extra willpower. I don't know why we do this to ourselves. So we scour our previous activities in the session looking for an excuse to grant one.
Well, there you go. You draw on the memory of recent acts to inspire your gumption. To your point, though, about things being a nightmare to track, I think the next one is where I kind of was like, this is going off the rails for me, which is breaking points. And the ordering is a little wonky here, because these tie into the integrity trait, which is like 30 pages later in this update. So we'll get to that. But
a couple final points on virtue and vice. Have fun doing weird ones. They do not have to make perfect sense. And this becomes doubly true when we get to monsters. The true Fae will invert virtue and vice or have truly bizarre ones. Second, virtue and vice wound up having a strong thematic impact in a lot of books, most notably Inferno, where you have demons associated with the 7 vices. When they open that up into play, it becomes a lot harder to build thematic things around virtue and vice, since there's no longer a set list to pull from. Breaking points.
Yeah, breaking points. So... briefly, this piece of the system ties into a character's morality and their sense of what is socially acceptable, plus the relationship of that morality to their personal psychology. For the purposes of character creation, there are 5 questions to answer here. What's the worst thing your character's ever done? What's the worst thing your character can imagine doing? What's the worst thing your character can imagine someone else doing? What has your character forgotten in terms of exposure to the supernatural, because we're talking about mortals here? And what's the most traumatic thing that has ever happened to your character? Again, this feels like a formalization of questions that can and probably should be asked anyway in the prelude, which will eventually be tied into actual dice mechanics, putting those to one side for now. I appreciate the desire to move away from the standardized hierarchy of sins that this replaces. Certainly, it gives a better mouthfeel of subjective experience. But as a storyteller, how much of a nightmare is this to track? I mean, virtue and vice is one thing, but all of the breaking points for individual players.
Surprisingly, not that difficult because it just boils down to three things. Character performs an action that either violates his personal moral code or that is considered unacceptable in society. The character witnesses something traumatic, terrifying, or that rattles his understanding of the world. Or the character is the victim of a supernatural attack, whether physical, emotional, or mental. I've found that I can usually intuit when it's a right time to call for a breaking point, and the players usually go, yeah, actually, that sounds about right.
And we'll get into this with Changeling. So, like the clarity breaks we get in Lost 2nd Edition, there is a whole page of suggestions, options, whether you want to use all of them or some of them. I know I've kind of looked at other 2nd Edition books. I guess off the top of your head, are there similar long lists in Vampire, Werewolf, Mage, etc.?
Off the top of my head, I think that Changeling has the most extensive treatment of their breaking points in terms of modifiers, and it can take a little bit of time in Changeling to put all of those together, unfortunately.
Well, I guess that's what we get for playing Trauma, the game.
My best advice for players is please do not worry about the long list of modifiers that you see. Just use them as guidance on what you want the breaking points modifier to be rather than spending time atomizing whether one is appropriate.
Yeah.
I do have a few other thoughts on breaking points before we move on. The first two are tied together. What have you forgotten is a very important question because it says something about the nature of the supernatural in the world of darkness. Everybody that is a player character, and pretty much everybody in the world, I think, has had some encounter with the supernatural. They've just pushed it down, forgotten it, or explained it away. Which ties into the second point that there's an undercurrent in the rules update going forward that mortals in the world of darkness kind of know that the supernatural exists. It's just they do not want to acknowledge it because it breaks their mind. And that means that it's kind of okay to have a supernatural go around doing low-level supernatural stuff because the most common mortal reaction will be, I didn't see it, I don't want to acknowledge it, and I know that if I acknowledge it, something bad will happen. That's not to say that mortals have like gigantic libraries of this information or they could tell you all of the clans of vampires or that they're even consciously aware of this, but the subconscious is enough. A final point is that all of the game lines will now use different systems of morality, and they will now be wildly different from each other, oftentimes breaking the system of the 10 through 0 scale that we see with morality/integrity. I look forward to that coming up with Changeling.
Well, before we get deep into the morality side, though, we've got a few other character creation chunks to get through.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
Well, no, not weird. That's not in here. So we have experience next. And with experience, we're replacing the old multiplier system with a pure dots cost this much system for a few different traits. A new dot in merit or willpower or a new skill specialty costs 1 experience. A new dot in a skill costs 2. New dot in integrity costs 3 in the rules update, which they revised down to 2 in the Chronicles scorebook. And a new dot in an attribute costs 4. So remember, this is the base mortal stuff. And you might think, wow, that's pretty cheap. But we also have this new microcurrency called beats. So rather than just bank up some experience at the end of each session, dramatic moments during the game allow you to earn beats, 5 of which become 1 experience. You get these through things like fulfilling an aspiration, exceptional role-playing, and my favorite, elect to make one of your failures into a dramatic one. You also do still get one automatically at the end of the session, and there's other sort of ways to get one. The way that you can think about this new system is like a new dot in a skill costs 10 dramatic moments. There's also a sidebar for group beats as an optional rule. If there's a dramatic moment, the whole group can share in. So I understand how storytellers simply assigning dots at the end of a session can feel a bit arbitrary, and this system offers more points of contact for building up experience while also encouraging role-playing. Storytellers have to be a little more conscious of when those moments happen, or players have to remind them, but it feels more narrative-driven than purely goal-driven, and I like that. So that said, while I haven't fully hashed out the math, it seems to me like advancement would be a little slower on the front end compared with the first edition, and then maybe a little faster as you get higher up. So consider how like a 1 dot merit in the old system would cost 2 experience, which you can easily swing in a single session, while here it costs 5 dramatic moments, which feels not impossible in one session, but maybe a little bit less likely. But then if you want to bump an attribute from 3 to 4, it takes 20 dramatic moments versus 20 experience, and the former feels much more doable. I can't recall how much first edition nWoD versus second edition Chronicles you've run, but do you have a sense of how that rate has shifted between editions?
Boy howdy, can I talk about that within the second edition version at least. You said this, but for emphasis for the readers, when it says something like a skill cost 2 experiences per dot, that does not mean that it's 2, then 4, then
Right.
8. It means that if you want to take a skill, if you want to take computer from 0 to 5, it costs you a total of 10 experiences.
50 dramatic moments.
Yes. Now, in the previous edition, the idea of the multiplicative experience is something that I have seen groups struggle with because it's a system where if you know what you're doing, you can sometimes game it at the beginning and start with a character that is significantly better than another person's character. You can even do it entirely by accident. So I do love the change to being a flat experience system. That said, I've weirdly not had much issue with that in like Old World of Darkness. I somehow just earn enough experience points that even with multiplicative experience, it just kind of winds out that I have way more experience than I ever need. And I'm also a kind of person who does not wind up spending much experience. You get so many goodies at character creation that I can spend 3 stories, like 9 sessions or so, just playing around with the abilities I have, to say nothing of all the goodies that I can acquire later on. So I don't think it's really that big of a deal either way, even if I think flat that is a bit better. Puka, how many beats per session would you guess that I give out?
I mean, I would say if you consider beats to be functionally similar to old experience, like 3 to 5 would be a reasonable amount per player.
Okay. My average is 5. I sometimes have sessions where players get 10, and I occasionally have some where they get 3, but 5, maybe 6 or so is about average for me.
There's also a difference between, in the old system, it is beneficial for you to kind of drag out a story, because it's like if your storyteller has planned for you to face this puzzle or this villain that's adapted to your experience level, and they intended to take 1 session and you drag it out to 4, you're going to get 4 sessions of experience to like beef up your power level.
Yep.
And I don't know, I guess it's still similar in this new system, except it's not raw time that you're trying to stretch out. You're trying to role play up because you want more of those beats per story.
One of them can be a little difficult to do, and there is a concern about uneven experience. First, the storyteller can choose to award a beat for any exceptional example of role-playing, tactics, or character development. I use that extensively. I do not award those beats during the game session itself. At the end of a session, I do stars and wishes, where we all go around the table and say what we liked about what other players did during the game. And for every unique star that a player has for someone, myself included, I give out 1 beat. But who do those beats go to? Well, I use the optional rule for group beats, where I take all of the beats that were earned during the session, put them in a pot, divide it by the number of players, and give them that many beats.
Pull the tips. Sorry, it's food service lingo. So then we get merits, which I think function pretty much the same way, except they say here fighting styles have been expanded to styles in general for any linear progression of maneuvers. Later on, we get like parkour and fast talking. The new concept attached here is sanctity of merits. The idea being, if you spend experience on a merit that you later lose, you should be refunded those points to spend on a new merit in a way that makes sense as a narrative consequence. And I know this is a house rule people have used in World of Darkness for things like backgrounds. On the one hand, I accept the principle. On the other hand, this is the World of Darkness, and if you lose something, you lose it. But ultimately, I understand the economy of points here. And obviously, this only applies to merits that aren't internal aspects of your character, I guess, unless your memory gets erased or you suffer some kind of extreme injury or something. But it's like if your ally dies, you get a new ally. There's then a fiction interlude in the form of a letter that's sort of post-Matrix, slightly fetishistic biomechanical nightmare of this dude entering and becoming subsumed by the God-Machine. Creepy. I just kind of shrugged, though, because I'm like, well, I haven't read the Chronicle yet, so this is good flavor. And then 20 pages of merits, kind of just a grand collection of all of the ones from the first edition General Blue books, maybe with a few thrown in from other lines. There are a few subsystems where appropriate, like professions and cults, and then supernatural merits like clairvoyance and psychokinesis. So did you have any favorites to call out, or are there any surprises in this merits write-up?
Yes, a few things. First, to your point about it's the World of Darkness, dang it.
I mean...
No, it's a fair point, Puka, is what I'm trying to say, is that this is a great thing to cover during a session 0 with the group. That discussion should be, how gritty do we want our game? You could very well have a game where everyone goes, yeah, forget sanctity of merits. We want a game where our characters risk burning. Yeah, get screwed, risk burning out, make decisions with unexpected consequences. I think that's a really cool game. I wouldn't use it as the default, but if everyone likes it, go for it. Second, a lot of merits cost significantly less than they did in previous editions. So striking looks goes from being, I think, 2 to 4 dots to being only 1 or 2 dots, for example.
I have a thought about that, and I wonder if it's just because compared with the start of the universe, there are so many more merits to divide points into at this stage. I mean, it's kind of the same thing you see with Mage the Ascension, where they get extra background points, but there are so many backgrounds. So the economy of it has to be a little bit more expansive.
Final general point is that many of the merits from first edition get revised. For the better, oftentimes for balance. Fighting styles are significantly different. In first edition, they often granted you extra actions, which, as we all know, is king. Why would you ever want something else? And they mostly got rid of that in second edition. However, it does not change the fact that fighting styles are awesome and you should take them for your characters, because truly the greatest power that you can possess in the World of Darkness is 5 dots of boxing. That will take you a lot further than trying to devise how many points you want to put into vigor.
Fair. It's also worth pointing out that if you become a supernatural creature, you lose your supernatural merits. But with Sanctity of Merits, you can presumably buy other things.
Those are so cool. I love the supernatural merits.
Yes.
I ran a Victorian Age Second Sight game where the characters were all terrible rich people, but I repeat myself, who were part of the Theosophical Society. It was them going about investigating supernatural mishaps that often wound up being darkly comedic. And for that one, I said, every one of you just take a supernatural merit, which enabled them to do bizarre things like teleport. So your starting mortal characters can be ridiculous if you allow them to do these things. And you know what? I think that is perfectly fine. There is a vague sense of dark, whimsical fun to the World of Darkness, and that is high on the list here. The merit that I most want to point out is professional training. Look, I love a lot of merits, And professional training is one that I love and hate. Professional training is a 5-dot merit path where you say, this is my character's lot in life. Now, that could be that your character is a doctor or an engineer or a technician, but you could just as easily say that they're a thug or a vagrant. And the point of taking one of these professions is that you get a lot of benefits to it. The first dot of professional training gives you 2 dots of contacts, so it's just better than taking a dot in contacts. And then it only gets more impressive from there. 9 to gain rules on several skills, get an extra skill, get discounts on skills, get the ability to get rote. If you don't take it, you are missing out on a chance to better define your character. And I must say, get a lot of fun mechanical advantages.
I mean, in V5 terms, this is essentially lore sheets. Like, you can take the artist lore sheet or the engineer lore sheet because each of the 5 levels is rather unique. So they're all kind of skill related, but it kind of does different things at each level. It's not a single effect.
Yes, that is part of the fun of it, that it's 5 separate benefits, not one scaling
I'm
benefit.
still taking psychokinesis, though.
Oh gosh, I had somebody with psychokinesis in one of my hunter games, and it's kind of ridiculously cool.
Beautiful.
I mean, just look at it. R reading, biokinesis, shifting your dots, clairvoyance. Oh, the really fun one is cursed. You can take cursed as a merit, which means you are in fact cursed. However, it says, while she knows how she will die, this is actually a liberating experience. Confident of the method of her death, so nothing else faces her. +2 on any resolve plus composure rolls to face fear or self-doubt. And you get an additional beat whenever you take damage in one of your last 3 health boxes. How wonderfully macabre! You should read the supernatural merits and allow them.
Didn't work out so well for Macbeth. Just saying.
How about yourself? What do you love?
I am a sucker for psychokinesis whenever it appears. So I do also like things like Thief of Fate, though. I enjoy
That
the
is a
little,
good one.
or Mind of a Madman, the sort of little weird one-off powers that are kind of story seeds in and of themselves.
Tell the audience about Thief of Fate before I move on, because that is really good.
You just unintentionally steal the good fortune of others, and it's nice to be the luckiest character.
To be clear, when it says that you steal the good fortune of someone else, you spend a point of willpower, and any failures that subject makes for the rest of the day are considered dramatic failures, and anytime you spend willpower for the rest of the day, you get 4 dice instead of 3. That's really good. That's better than a lot of supernatural benefits that I've seen, and it costs you 3 experience points to have it.
Yep. So after all that, we move out of the character creation side into more game system-y stuff, beginning with conditions. These are not traits which you purchase, but which get applied to your character, like guilty or spooked. Some of them are labeled persistent, like amnesia or obsession. Each gives some kind of bonus or benefit or drawback and can come from various factors, ranging from exceptional successes to supernatural powers to storyteller fiat, and they all have conditions under which they are resolved and go away. Persistent ones, less straightforwardly so, but they can offer 1 beat per game session when they complicate your life. Persistent conditions essentially replace the concept of flaws, which to me feels like a narrative shift that's difficult to define, maybe externalizing them a bit more than in previous versions of the system. I don't know. But we round out the section with guidance on creating your own, which to me, this is like one of the major opportunities for Chronicles homebrew. My question for you as a storyteller is, how easily or freely do you hand out and resolve conditions in your game? And maybe do you think this is a metric to compare with other storytellers? Maybe it doesn't matter so much, but yeah.
Conditions are another thing that I have a love-hate relationship with.
They're also cards, and everybody loves cards, I should point out.
Everybody does love cards. So the cool idea behind conditions is that it's a unified system by which you can assign a mechanical benefit or drawback to a character and come up with a mechanical way to resolve it and then possibly give people beats for it. I like that idea. There are, however, some problems with it. Oftentimes, players do not know what they want to take for a condition, and coming up with a custom condition on the spot can be difficult to do. I find that frequently players will default to taking the inspired condition, which just says that you gain 3 successes instead of 5. Oh, and you gain a point of willpower. I'm not sure they kept that in Chronicles Core. But it's kind of the most boring option to take because it just kicks down an exceptional benefit down the road. That's not on the players, though, because there's a lot going on, and you do not want to stop a game to flip through 20 conditions, decide whether you want any of them, and if you do not, then decide that you are going to come up with a custom one. Later on, we'll be introduced to tilts, which are basically conditions but only in combat. And those will frequently introduce mechanics that say, it works like this in combat, but out of character, it should work differently. And due in part to the fact that this referenced first edition World of Darkness, it's often unclear what tilts do outside of combat, or even why we should have a condition/tilt distinction in the first place. I get the idea, but it doesn't always make sense in practice. I miss flaws. There is this design space where you could say, oh, my character begins with a cursed condition. Or perhaps they have some other neat trait, like kid, my character is starting out as a child. And that seems like a fun opportunity to expand character options, but they never do anything with that. There's no second edition book that says, here's a list of neat conditions you could take at character creation with storyteller permission. Huge missed opportunity.
Something that just occurs to me, is there actually any like dot-based or I guess condition-based way to signify having an enemy? Because I actually don't know that there is.
Well, there is... Oh, they don't have it in this book. Hunted, for example, which will return in grand style in Changeling 2nd edition.
Yeah, but that's different though, isn't it?
Well, it does mean that somebody is coming to get you.
Maybe rival is like what I'm more thinking. I don't know. I just to the point you just made, there are situations that I can think of which feel neither like they should be represented as merits or even persistent conditions. And that design space is something to explore.
This is where you should be putting things like enemy, if you want to have a condition that represents an enemy that will show up.
Okay. It's just not in.
Correct. Again, missed opportunity. Try to make up for it in your own games. I did mention that creating conditions is hard. I personally love doing it. When I am inspired to come up with a condition and write it out for my players, it takes me a little bit of time, but they are grateful. They always say, it's cool, they love it. One of the most recent ones I came up with was a character was being very introspective about her life for the first time. And I gave her a condition where she could get a +2 dice on connecting people. And I told her that if your character has a breakthrough and you announce it in game, your character having this emotional breakthrough about compassion and understanding people, you gain a beat, and during that same scene, you can, without a roll, dictate that an NPC opens up their heart to you.
No. See, you said the first time they were introspective, and I was like, did they get the "am I the asshole" condition? But
basically, yes, they did.
No, I agree. I think it is a really rich space. Do you ever cap the number of conditions that you give out, though? Because once somebody has like 3 or 4 at once, it can get a little bit complicated.
I have 2 thoughts on complication. I'll be saving my original one for my last point. But to answer your question, oh god, yes, absolutely. Conditions are emblematic of that concern which I've raised with aspirations and breaking points and virtue and vice, which is it's a lot to keep track of for anybody. And I will usually remember 1, maybe 2 conditions on a player, but more than that, and I cannot do it. Also, more than that, and it becomes an exercise in frustration for the player. How do I resolve all of these conditions? How am I supposed to play my character when I'm weighed down with 3 negative conditions? I learned my lesson about that when I ran Mage 2nd edition, and I let the game get too heavy on paradox conditions. Do not do that. Just pick a cool one, maybe modify it if things get more complicated. and have fun.
Nice.
The other point I want to make, though, is that conditions get very complicated in future books. It's not a bad thing in this book where you just go, oh yeah, occasionally a condition gets referenced in one of the merits, and I'll just flip back over to the conditions section and find it and apply that. When you get to the second edition books for the splat lines, they begin putting rules in the conditions, and they put those conditions in the appendix. There is an entire section in second edition Changeling about a neuromancy and all of the consequences of what it can do to a person, which is a layered set of effects, are only found in the appendix. It is very easy to miss these rules. The worst example of this comes in Geist. When they did the Kickstarter for Geist 2nd edition, they released the book plain text, chapter by chapter, to the readers. Fine, cool, I think that's a great idea. The problem came when they got to the chapter that had all of your manifestations, or haunts as they became in 2nd edition. Because that chapter references a condition for every single power that you have.
No.
And they are fundamental to the function of it. And the fans said, we literally cannot understand how to use these powers as written. And Onyx Path had to release the appendix with all the conditions from the book in order to make that chapter functional to read. That should not be how conditions work in this game.
Yeah, I mean, that is the risk when you offload kind of out of the powers into a separate system. But I mean, that's why, like, cards do help, I think. If you actually have them out on the table, if you're fortunate enough to be gaming in person, having that visual aid is nice.
Which I don't, and we're not.
Yeah.
So for you, me, and everybody else who's primarily playing digital.
Post-it notes.
Yeah, post-it notes, go back to the pages.
Yeah.
Maybe open up that fan-made book about a bunch of custom conditions. It's a lot. You shouldn't have to do this much heavy lifting. It's very clearly, to me, based upon the situational aspects from Fate, capital F-A-T-E, which was ostensibly a pretty simple system for giving bonuses or penalties to characters, and it gets kind of bloated here, unfortunately.
So after that, we get integrity, because now we're returning to those breaking point questions and how to mechanize those moments in-game. There is a thorough deconstruction of the first edition morality system here, where they point out that its connection of morality to sanity, the whole degeneration and derangement thing, it may fit with a classic Gothic Victorian ethos, but they've moved away from this in favor of something more subjective and founded on, in their words, functionality within society on the basis of how well a character copes with what they've seen or done. I'm on board with that idea, though I'll also point out that it's still pretty easy to still have integrity loss tied to mental health conditions in this new system. But mechanically, when you face one of your breaking points, or anything the player storyteller decides is a breaking point, for mortals, incidentally, here, there's a sidebar which advises murder should always be a breaking point. The system is you roll resolve plus composure, modified on the basis of your integrity rating, and a bunch of other things like whether you're protecting yourself, whether you're witnessing versus enduring something, etc. And if you succeed on that roll, you preserve your integrity. Fail, and you lose a point and gain a condition, which, if it's a dramatic failure, becomes persistent. All of that makes sense to me, but here's my question. Putting aside soul loss, which we'll get to in a second, and supernatural specific variations like clarity, which is a whole 55-gallon drum of worms that we'll plunge our hands into when we get to that core book, is there any ongoing significant disadvantage to having low integrity? I get that it can apply a penalty to a roll here and there, but as long as you don't dramatically fail a roll on your way down the spiral and get a persistent condition, is there any actual kind of blanket disadvantage? And the answer might be no, but that would say something about the game setting to me.
Not really, no. The biggest disadvantage is that you are less likely to get the exceptional success where you instantly gain a beat and regain a point of willpower. And in turn, that means you are much more likely to get the guilten, shaken, or spooked conditions, all of which affect the way you roleplay your character. Personally, I think they affect it for the better. Narratively, this just means that your character is more likely to get disturbed by things that are happening to them. Other than that, though, no, there's not really a lot of disadvantage for just being at a lower rating. I think it is fine to say that all those disadvantages come in the corners of the system. Like,
Mhm.
I'm still very fond of the fact that in first edition, the book Inferno says that if you make a promise to a demon and you drop down to a single dot of morality or integrity here, they can drag you into hell.
How about
That's
that?
really cool. And I think there's like an example in Changeling or Vampire of a frailty where if you are around mortals that have like 8, 9, or 10 integrity, either they sense you or like you freak out around them, like your powers don't work very well. Kind of like how Truth Faith worked in the original World of Darkness. So it does things, but they're found on the periphery, and I think it's
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah, I think the thing about this, I'm gonna just say this and then table it because I want to keep moving. But to me, it kind of avoids objective value judgments in and of themselves about things like premeditated murder, which I suspect might be more problematic than some groups might realize. And from my perspective, wrangling with those issues in character can be a really powerful exercise for players. But the fact that this book has a whole spiel about, well, what role should a morality system play in the game at all? It suggests to me that they would prefer to abstain from that question entirely. And, it's a choice.
I don't think they mean to abstain entirely from the question of like how much should hurting someone affect you. In fact, I think that's meant to be a preoccupation when you're answering the 5 questions over what affects your character, and then later on when
Well,
a storyteller asks you, should this affect your character?
I think, though, I would suspect there are players who fixate on those 5 things to the exclusion of others. I don't know. I mean, maybe we need to have a whole discussion about this later, but it's just something that's going to sit in my mind. We saw alternate morality systems in mirrors, and are any of those a better fix than this? Or do you think this is kind of the best possible option relative to that?
I'm very fond of this option, especially because it emphasizes that the supernatural can affect you
Hmm.
in negative ways, which wasn't so much of a concern in the original integrity system. I really like that. I think that all the systems from mirrors are fun alternatives to this, but they are all going for something specific. So
Yeah,
do what you think is going to be most interesting for your game. All of them have advantages.
that's fair, yeah. The sort of offshoot here is we then get a section on soul loss, which this section might point to one of the starkest contrasts with Old World of Darkness, where the soul is this nebulous thing that doesn't have any actual mechanical weight around it, maybe until you get to like Demon the Fallen or something. And I prefer that. The book states that this system is kind of only ties into rare and powerful magic that can actually harm or remove the soul, which I imagine is very relevant to the God-Machine Chronicle. And the way they kind of present it here is you get persistent conditions when your soul gets removed, which mess with your willpower regain, slowly erode your integrity, and eventually turn you into an empty husk of a person unless you manage to regain said soul. I found this overall more complicated than interesting, but I would consider adapting some of the systems here to kind of turn into a generalized penalty structure for integrity loss, if there isn't one, you know what I mean? But I don't know. I don't know if this soul loss thing has come up in your games. I wasn't into it.
It has not come up for my player characters. It does occasionally come up for NPCs who have been affected by other NPCs, or
Hmm.
very occasionally by the PCs. Obviously, I do not focus upon the conditions that they suffer by doing this because that would be too complicated for an NPC.
Yeah.
You mentioned a concern about how you preferred the old World of Darkness version. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, just that the soul doesn't have any real mechanical meaning in Old World of Darkness as a thing.
I like it in New World of Darkness because if we're going for a consistent world, then having a consistent idea of things that affect the soul is useful, along with a general idea of saying that even though there's mechanics for it, it's not something that neatly corresponds to anybody's understanding of the cosmology of the world. It becomes an important trait, kind of low key, throughout the rest of the games. Supernatural creatures that started out as mortals in Chronicles of Darkness, I think universally have had something done to their soul. Either it's been taken out and replaced, like with Sin Eaters, or damaged in some way, such as how the thorns tear away at the souls of changelings and the weird fills the gaps. I love that stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm purely talking mechanically. Like, the question, what is a soul, in Old World of Darkness has lots of different fuzzy answers. But in New World of Darkness, or at least in this rule set, you have equally fuzzy answers conceptually, but you can also say it is this set of mechanical items triangulating integrity, willpower, virtue, vice, and that side of it is something I don't really care to engage with, is all I'm saying.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, to your point, like having the narrative of what can happen to a soul. Yeah, absolutely. So conditions and integrity and all that are still on the character sheet systems fundamentally. But as we read on, we move into more general gameplay systems like a deeper dive into extended actions, everybody's favorite. Honestly, I'm not sure what the thought process was for this, because they started with the usual principle of you do a series of rolls, storyteller sets number of successes required and amount of time between rolls. Number of rolls you get is equal to the dice pool itself, roughly. They streamlined this relative to first edition core, which has like pages of text on it. And then they padded it out with these variations like, if you fail a roll, either take a condition or abandon the action. Or if you don't quite complete the action in time, it results in some wiggly calculus based on proportion of successes relative to the target. And then in the second edition core book, they stripped back that near misses part and streamlined the rest, which I think is the right move, or at least to make it optional. So I say that all this as someone who, while storytelling, tends to be pretty hand-wavy about the finer details of things like extended roll permutations. From your perspective, how much of this drilling down comes up regularly in-game?
It doesn't. I don't use extended actions.
Sorted. Yeah, it's just too much. Like, just let players be players,
You don't need to check how many successes people get for, let me see this, replacing the brakes on a car.
Right.
Just make it a roll. Or preparing a violin solo worthy of a world-class performance. That doesn't need to be 20 successes. I do think that extended actions can be interesting for something that's very much in the moment. Like if you're doing a story where your characters are being chased by a werewolf and you're like, we don't have a weapon. Okay, well, can I jerry-rig together a chainsaw? Well, okay, then maybe making it an extended action where you need to accumulate a certain number of successes while your allies are trying to hold off the monster, that could be good. Otherwise, don't bother with a roll at all because they have time to do it. Or just make it a single action, an instant action. It's fine, a single roll to represent it. The only other time I can think of it being useful is if you do want to represent gradual progress over time. If you want to do that, I suggest you just substitute in clocks from the Forge in the Dark system in place of this. It'll do you a lot better.
Also, unless you're a knocker, you have no business jerry-rigging a chainsaw. That's how you lose a hand. Anyway, I am a little bit annoyed about the placement of the fiction interludes here, because we get social maneuvering and a few sentences and then like 4 pages of fiction.
I noticed that too.
So before we get to that, this fiction interlude is a World War I era guy writing a letter to his dead brother about his journey into the God-Machine complex to acquire a soul for the mechanical woman he's been making, which only costs him an acquaintance and possibly his sanity. I think this one hung together a little bit better than the last one, and this is like, we are going to see connections between these fictions. But social maneuvering. This is getting into the more actual storytelling, and it's sort of a mode of play that's being introduced for when role-playing alone won't do the trick. This will also have connections to the investigation and chase systems, which appear only in the Chronicles of Darkness core book, also being alternate modes of play. And as I said with our read-through of Mirrors, I tend to find systems like this more trouble than they're worth, but I like that these are more guidance around a narrative structure rather than roll X for Y, like dice-based stuff. But before we get into like the details of each of these, are these kinds of systems a regular feature in your games? And how do players engage with them in relation to just in-character role-playing and dialogue?
They don't.
Okay. No, same.
Some more serious answer, though. I have tried using social maneuvering, investigation, and chases in my games.
Mhm.
It is mostly a botched attempt. I don't know. Do you like the hedge navigation system from 1E?
Again, I don't think I'd particularly feel like it needed to be mechanized in the way it was, but
Well, they double down on it in 2E. It now uses the chase subsystem, and it is elaborate to the point that my players hated it the
Mhm.
one time that I did it. Social maneuvering is the only one that I have really pressed, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is that, as somebody has explained it, that you can use this. Okay,
we should explain it first, maybe.
well, could you explain what
So
social
yeah.
maneuvering is, and then I can.
So yeah, the way that it's set up here is that you enter into a social action with like a big G goal, be it manipulating someone or forming a cult or whatever, in front of which you plant a number of obstacles or milestones that are called big D doors, the number based upon the lower of resolve or composure with a bunch of modifiers. There's a first impression system, which kind of resembles, was it Sway in Mirrors that had like the building up influence over time?
I think it was Sway. There was like 4 different name systems.
Yeah.
It's like trying to keep the 5 epiphanies straight from dreaming.
Oh, that's easy. So you then use some kind of roll to signify getting past the obstacles presented by each door, and a failure lets you take a beat because we all learn from failure. When you get through the final door, the goal has been achieved, sometimes by any means necessary. The only thing that I could see this as being helpful for is maybe like understanding how the relationship web in your game between the different characters can evolve over time, because it can help you compare the narrative weight you're giving to every player's arc. It's maybe too inorganic for my tastes because it almost feels like it's trying to create balance by assigning actual numbers to that variability. I can see how it could be helpful for some, I guess is the way I would frame it.
I do want to talk about my impressions of it, but do you perhaps want to explain the difference between opening doors and forcing doors?
Oh well, I mean, I didn't want to drill down that deep into it.
Oh, well, this
I mean,
is.
if you want to explain.
I'll explain because it's important to the point that I'm going to make.
Okay.
So first off, I agree that it's hard to use this. So the default system, I think the key thing that didn't come up here is that by default, I want everybody in the audience to think quickly about the time scale that your games take place over. Got it? Okay, great. Now, imagine if you could only roll once a week against somebody to try to convince them to let you borrow an occult book from them. Not great. Not practical for a lot of adventures, especially one-shots. And this is important because social maneuvering in the rules update is meant to wholly replace the social action system. It's not an addition. You're supposed to play off of people's vices and use gifts and bribes and merits to improve the impression, such that good is only 1 day between rolls. That's still a lot. Excellent is 1 hour between rolls. Hard to get to, and also pretty inconvenient. And at perfect, it's 1 turn between rolls, at which point it's like, do I even care about the social maneuvering system at that point?
Well, yeah.
So this is troublesome, but it could work in a pre-made adventure where you know where the players are going to be and who they have to deal with, and you can control the time scale. It can also be nice for a game where, like you said, people are really into a relationship web. I've tried doing that. It never really clicked for me or my group, but you could theoretically have a list of things you're trying to convince people of over a long period of time. Forcing doors is what you would probably use. So you take all of those doors that you would normally have, and instead of trying to wheedle a person over a number of hours or days or weeks,
Drug them.
Well, no, here's the thing. So the
it's on the list.
Okay, we're gonna get there. The forcing doors, the basic of it is just you do something to try to get somebody to go along with what you're saying immediately. And that could be anything. The downside of it is that you only get one roll at it, and if you fail, that's kind of it.
Yeah.
Now, what you're thinking of is hard leverage, which is where you point a gun at somebody's head, and depending upon how much that messes you up, it makes the roll that much easier. It's weird. But forcing doors is what you would typically use. Now, why do all of this instead of the standard system? Well, you probably shouldn't, but I've made an attempt here in like third year of my ongoing campaign to try to use social maneuvering because Beast, the game that I'm running, uses social maneuvering as a fundamental part of many of its powers.
Ugh.
And that is also true for some of the other splats. So you cannot get away from it. There are entire sections of powers or whole merits, even in the core book that we're reading right now, that will do absolutely nothing if you do not use this system.
See, that smacks of poor design to me. But to your point, though, about time, like what you're pointing to with one turn being too rapid a tempo, 1 week being too slow, to me, the happy medium is one scene because that's already a flexible unit of time that makes sense narratively. Like, okay, you've made an attempt to socially maneuver in this scene. You're going to have to wait till the next scene with this person to make another. That makes sense, right?
They should do that. Yes, I agree.
Well, hindsight's 2020. The other two systems, investigations, are about accumulating clues rather than going through these social doors if you want a more Holmesian game for your mortals. And then chases are exactly that, pursuer trying to catch the pursued, which can create more of a thriller or horror vibe if you use a lot of those scenes. And I think I like those slightly more, not enough to use them probably, but at least with investigation, it feels a little more nuanced. And chases are really just a contested role with extra steps rather than a whole new system. They're taking what's already like an established thing and extending it. But yeah, I mean, to your point about getting bogged down in the weeds of this, I don't think either should be like fundamental and unavoidable for a game.
I'm going to make it even worse for you.
No.
So, first off, I think every time I've done chases that didn't turn into a big morass of like failure and things not going anywhere, instead turned into whoever goes first just wins. Once you have any level of supernatural aspect, or even if you don't, just take fleet of foot. You are going to just win chases, and there's no drama to it. Again, clocks. And second, while investigation sounds good, I must point you to page 45 of the Chronicles book, the investigative prodigy merit. So basically, you need to get typically 1 to 5 clues to come up with an answer. And it's the players who come up with the answer, not the game master. It's meant to represent the players coming up with investigating something and deciding what a cool supernatural thing might be. They kind of forget about that, maybe even in the same book, but whatever. The point here is that you normally only get 1 clue per success. Makes sense. But Investigative Prodigy says, instead of simply uncovering clues or not uncovering clues when investigating, your character discovers multiple clues in a single action. Your character can uncover clues equal to his successes or his merit dots as an instant action, whichever is lower. So that means that if you take Investigative Prodigy at, well, any dot really, but 5 dots, you instantly end any investigation because you can just pick up 5 clues the first time you roll for it. They did not consider this system very well when they made it.
You mentioned the clocks earlier, and just kind of as a side comment here, to me, this points a little bit to, when I say alternate modes of play, like, I do think it is kind of trying to split the game into multiple games, and they're trying to have it be the possibility of every different game happening at once. But they didn't need to create these entire mechanical infrastructures for each of those modes of play. Because, as you just pointed to, unless you are baking that into the system from the start, I think it kind of ends up being haphazard. Like, there are games that are designed to be about investigations, and the mechanics make sense because it's all kind of designed around that package. World of Darkness is not that game. They are hitching something onto their core here. You really see that come to the fore when you get those bits that run into each other like that. So, yeah. But speaking of modes of play, the alternate mode of play that most groups are going to be familiar with is, of course, combat, because you do shift into this other sort of mindset and approach to the game when you enter a combat scene. So as we get into that section, there's a bit more about framing the narrative of the combat before actually getting into it, which I like, determining what the intent is, whether you want to surrender, etc. But mechanically, there are lots and lots of tweaks to various combat systems. And you know me and getting into the weeds around those. So while I know that one of the major changes is like any kind of weapon always does lethal, and I definitely want to talk about tilts, before we get to that, how much stands out to you that's different about this combat framework versus first editions? Is it mostly minor tweaks, or are there like major overhauls to call out?
Oh, first off, I cannot promise I did combat correctly in first edition.
I don't think anyone can promise that.
But a few key things that jump out at me. The introduction of down and dirty combat, where you resolve combat in a single roll, was a boon to the game and always kind of should have been there. You should always have a one roll resolution for things. The idea of switching out weapons do dice to weapons do automatic successes was a big deal. In first edition, weapons would add dice to your attack roll. In second edition, if you hit, they add automatic successes. This sounds kind of cool, but leads to a problem in any game where you can build up weapon damage. I have a player character in one of my games who can just easily do like 15 lethal to a person.
Then you were playing Exalted.
Yes, in a game which has no sense of balance or scaling, somewhat intentionally.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, armor does not keep up with that, so it really does become a game of rocket tag. The introduction of the combat tilts is okay, just kind of differently mechanizing things that we already have, and I think that summarizes the things that really jumped out at me. Oh, no, one other one. They say beaten down is an optional rule. Do not listen to them. Beaten down will show up in every other splat book as something that characters will constantly be able to do. Most notably, ogres in second edition have the ability to inflict the beaten down tilt, I think, whenever they successfully hit somebody.
Ogre smash.
The beaten down tilt says you are out of the fight unless you spend willpower every turn you want to remain in the fight. Get wrecked.
Yeah. I mean, this just kind of intensifies my feeling of combat being nasty, brutish, and short in this system. But tilts, though, I really like tilts. And essentially, they're just conditions in a combat scene. They can be either personal or environmental. They don't give conditions, but they can lead to conditions once the combat ends. Like the example being, you get the blinded tilt in a fight, which can lead to the blind condition after, which can potentially persist until you get medical attention and heal all of the points of damage, one hopes. So each of these has specific effects and modifiers, and like conditions, I find this a really great area of expansion for homebrewing and modding your own bespoke ideas into a chronicle. And these are near and dear to my heart because in the second edition game that I played, my Changeling was an elemental with the Elemental Fury cantrip, which lets you inflict those environmental tilts on an area and do damage on top of it. So I was constantly doing area of effect spells.
Excellent. Oh, that's good.
The loophole is also ranting and raving, which was fun to get creative with. So yeah, I really like these. The last bit here updates systems on a few sources of harm, namely car wrecks, disease, drugs, poison, and extreme environments they turn into more of a general scalar system of severity, which I like. Again, is there anything new and noteworthy in here that we should call out about harm?
I kind of don't like the idea of the environments being tilts instead of conditions. A lot of them have general systems that really should be used for just being in that environment overall. Note that the systems for drugs and poisons will assume that you do have access to the first edition World of Darkness book to reference, which of course you would, but when we get to Chronicles of Darkness, they accidentally leave in that same assumption. So no rules for marijuana for you.
So then we get another bit of fiction, this time a letter from the mechanical woman the World War I guy created. It is weird and stalkery. But interestingly, it's also written almost 100 years later, which will become relevant later. Then the penultimate major chunk of the rules update. This is really a chomper of a book. I know we keep talking about the density of these books, but still. So we have ephemeral beings, ghosts, spirits, and angels, about whom we must necessarily keep this top level because there's a lot here. So this rule set update brings together and updates ghost rules, maybe ghost concepts too, which I think you've mentioned before, along with spirit rules from really most of the games except Changeling, which didn't need them much because who does when you've got hedge beasts? And then unifying those provides a basis on which to build angels for the God-Machine Chronicle. So they have these descriptive phrases, which I thought were helpful, where they say ghosts are echoes of the dead, spirits are warped reflections, and angels are functions of the God-Machine. And as mentioned before, there's a specific set of tiered conditions that can be applied for talking about things like possession and manifestation and stuff. And as in first edition, they have one-off Numina powers to draw from. Beyond that, because we haven't covered any crossover but Geist yet, and their ephemeral entities are pretty particular, and also because we haven't done Book of Spirits, how much of this does a Changeling player coming from first edition need to know at a minimum? And it's not that Changeling can't engage with Twilight and Spirits, it just feels like the game line may be least designed to do so to me.
Oh, this isn't good. Okay. So I mentioned Twilight in our Geist episode, but to reiterate, beings exist on different frequencies. This is very important to understand because they do not explain that here. They do suggest that when in Twilight, only items, creatures, and phenomena that are also in Twilight and composed of the same ephemera can touch an ephemeral being, but that is very easy to miss. That doesn't mean ghosts, angels, and spirits can interact with each other. In fact, it's the opposite. Everything is categorically separate. The books will kind of forget about this and maybe also forget about the idea that Twilight does not exist in later books. Second edition Changeling will introduce the Helldivers, who have the ability to shift their Twilight frequency to whatever they want it to be.
That was my Changeling.
Oh, God, you just took the best power, didn't you?
It was really a great game.
And Whispers of Morning Glory, I think, which is a power that just makes you completely immune to harm unless your opponent is a Helldiver. It's arguably too good for getting away, but hell, it is a royal contract, so what the hey. They have kind of a half-done system for hedge ghosts, which are kind of sort of the same thing as ghosts, except they are more pure emotion-based. Unfortunately, the rules for them are a little bit incomplete. Oh, and this is very important. I hate to say this. I'm going to take back what I said about it kind of maybe not shouldn't matter very much, because the various splat books for second edition are intended to be standalone. The first line under creating hedge ghosts is, hedge ghost creation is similar to the rules for other ephemeral beings in Chronicles of Darkness rulebook, page 122, with a few notable differences. So I know you're supposed to be able to use just this book, but if you want to use them, you do kind of sort of need to have that book. They kind of get away with it and they give you most of what you would need anyway, so I think you could do without it, but you shouldn't be referencing back to that book for this thing. And if I recall correctly, there's some things that they leave unsaid about how hedge ghosts interact with things that need to be explained. It's really kind of a mess.
So to that point, though, I mean, do you think it's worth bringing any kind of spirits other than hedge ghosts into a Changeling game? Like, quite aside from needing the mechanical framework from the second edition core book. Like, is there any narrative benefit?
Yes, actually, because there's kiths that are based around interacting with specific ephemeral entities. There's one or two kits that are about dealing with the dead, like the true dead, actual ghosts, not hedge ghosts. But more generally speaking than that, yeah, I mean, of course, the Autumn Court is all about investigating every corner of the supernatural world of darkness for their benefit, and you should absolutely have dealing with spirits and angels and ordinary ghosts on the table, because your Autumn player is probably going to appreciate that. It doesn't need to be a focus of your game, but do keep it in mind.
Something that just occurs to me, do you know if they specify, so we had that like when a mortal becomes a supernatural being, they lose their supernatural merits and you replace them with the sanctity. We have systems in here for like exorcism, summoning, binding, etc. Can supernaturals still do those?
I believe that they can, as long as they still have a soul. And this becomes very important for something that we left out of Geist. Geist has a concept called ceremonies, which are rituals that your character can do. You cobble them together from whatever sounds cool for like summoning a ghost or banishing it. But importantly, in second edition Geist, they say, yeah, actually, all those like exorcism and abjuration, those are Geist ceremonies. And guess what? Any Geist ceremony can be done by ordinary people.
I ask because it's filed under mortal interaction with ephemeral entities here. So it's like, oh, is it only mortals? It doesn't really say. But yeah, it's worth thinking about.
I don't think it's meant to be unique to mortals. However, the later game lines will maybe kind of forget about that.
Yeah. And then in the Chronicles of Darkness core book, they sort of graft onto this system with horrors, which gets its own little mini splat embedded in that book. But despite their dread powers, these aren't your malevolent ephemeral spirits. These are your zombies, your demon hordes, your Jersey devils, your marshmallow men, your giant rabbits, your gelatinous masses, etc. Physical entities causing physical problems, among other kinds. Mothman was in here too, I'm glad to say. So this can certainly be fun for making kind of boss antagonists tailored to the particular horror in your game. What's your take on this design?
I love the idea. I have not made much use of it because I usually just pull monsters directly out of the books. But the idea of being able to make a custom monster is something that I think is very important to the game. I love it so much that I wish they had gotten rid of ephemeral entities and just used that instead to represent everything. It would have massively cut down on the word count in these books. They have big sections in a lot of the game lines where they have ephemeral entities and then their equivalent of horrors. And that did not need to be the case. It could have just been horrors. The best horror, of course, is that they have the Jersey Devil in here, but he's just kind of a bro, which I find very, very funny.
That tracks. Sorry.
My only problem with the system is kind of a big one, unfortunately. And that is that it's kind of hard to adjudicate how powerful these things could be, even with the guidance that they give. And the balance on them is kind of off. So you could give a monster... So you get a number of like horror points to spend on things they can do. And you can spend them on their various features, like the power to jump scare, where you just pop out of nowhere to come after somebody. Or immortal, where you just cannot kill the thing except through a very specific means. Or you could take natural weapons and have +1 lethal damage, and you can spend 3 of your horror points to give yourself a total of +3 lethal damage. Not a great idea. You should not do that.
Could we do the Overlook Hotel from The Shining with this system is really all I care about.
Yes, you can, because one of the examples of them is The House That Hates.
Aw. In the Chronicles book, they also give a few samples with stat blocks of mortal antagonists. Obviously, the best one is Excitable Munitions Expert, so a good addition. But returning to the God-Machine update, lastly, at long last, we come to the final piece, which is equipment, where we get the novel step of categorizing non-weapon equipment based on the skill it uses. Therefore, we have mental equipment, like automotive tools or glow stick, physical equipment, like a bear trap or night vision goggles, and social equipment, like cash and fashion. And then in this one, but not the Chronicles of Darkness core book, we get suitably quirky supernatural equipment, like a Kirlian camera or a protective amulet, plus bygones that get their own subsection in a second. I just also want to point out this crafting mechanic that's so beautifully crisp, it's like a haiku. I was crying. Anyway, so I like all of this, and I wonder, do you know how much of this might have come from the Armory or Armory Reloaded books? Because that's what it felt like, maybe.
I don't think very much of it did. My memory of the Armory books is that it was primarily concerned with weapons and armor, not so much other forms of equipment. I could be wrong, though. It's been a while since I've read them, and those books are chonky because...
people like their gear.
Look, people like their gear, and those are fantastic gear books everybody should read.
That's a shame, though, because, I mean, the idea here, it's so simple and straightforward, and it clarifies a great way to deploy these things in a scene without getting too rigid. Plus, there's a services chart in here, which is invaluable. So yeah, I really appreciated this.
I love the idea of the services chart. Unfortunately, the game is pretty weak in how it explains how you can make use of these things. We have this idea that you should be able to procure things if you have different skills, and that a service can do something like I can order a benefit of I'm trying to find an example.
Rush plastic surgery.
Yeah, like plastic surgery, and like I guess
Rush
like
plastic surgery.
that gives like a dice bonus on something. I don't really get why it's providing a benefit.
Fair, but I think there's enough here for me to kind of run with. When I say that it doesn't get too rigid, it gives you kind of this springboard. And for me as a storyteller, that's all I really want. But yeah, I mean, point taken.
I must also note that most services take a week to procure at the listed availability level, so please be careful about that in your games, because if you choose to do a one-shot or even a story that takes place over a day or two, your players are not going to be able to do this unless they have higher dots of resources, or I guess the relevant trait for these things.
Hey, you know what we could do? We could use social maneuvering to shorten that time scale.
Oh. One last thought on this. There is an idea in the original World of Darkness book that penalties and bonuses should not go above +5, -5. Individually, for sure, and possibly collectively, depending upon your group's preference. And they specify here, and I think also in that book, that equipment cannot go above +5 for bonuses. This is immediately broken with any of the splats in second edition. I'm not really sure about first, but there's game systems that just kind of do not work if you hold to this. For example, Changing Fortunes in Changeling second edition, it's +2 dice on an action per success you roll. And if you held people to a +5 bonus on that one, then the best you could do is roll 2.5 successes on something.
The good old half success.
One thing that is missing from here, though, a couple things. One, they do not include the rules for jury rigging equipment, which is too bad because that is a really cool idea for those frantic survival situations.
Is that not in the first edition core book?
Oh, maybe it is. Maybe it is, and they just reprinted it in second edition. You could be right. I know second edition had consequences for jury rigging that,
like losing your hand when you try to fashion a chainsaw.
Yeah, and the second thing that is missing from here, equipment types. Obviously, you have things like physical objects or getting a service. But in Chronicles, they will introduce, you can get bonuses from organizations, repositories, plans, or mystical equipment. Changeling introduces a thing called Mastermind's Gambit, where you can just give like a +5 to all rolls in a category for something made to execute a plan, and it gets ridiculous very quickly.
Right on. So then the last bit, we have bygones, which are all just magical items that do their own thing. Really, I'd more call them story hooks in artifact form. So the viral video.
Bad things, usually.
Usually bad things. The haunted doll, the viral video, etc. The line, smoking kills. Smoking, Mike smokes, kills quicker. Feels like something I heard on a TV ad back in the late 90s. Anyway, they're fun. I'm not sure why they didn't put these in the core book, but I wonder, like, was it just that they wanted the actually supernatural games to get the supernatural stuff? Did these work their way into a later blue book for Chronicles?
Oh, I have bad news for you there.
Oh.
So, bygones get referenced in other books. Don't think Changeling has this, but Beast will say, supernatural equipment deals with the paranormal, and bygones, blah, blah, blah. However, those are not in Beast the Primordial, nor are they in the other books that reference it. They just forgot.
How did this happen?
In fact, they are mentioned in the Chronicles of Darkness core book as well.
Where the rules no longer appear.
Correct, yes. They mention supernatural equipment and bygones, neither of which are in there. Also, they abbreviate the amount of gear you get. the equipment section in how many things are in social equipment in the rules update?
7? 6 or 7?
Chronicles has only 3 of them: cash, disguise, and fashion. The other 4 are gone.
Well, like one of the ones in the update is housing, and I'm like, okay, well maybe that got shifted into a merit or something. But makeup kit, polygraph machine.
In fact, I think it specifies in Chronicles of Darkness that when you go to maybe its safe place, hey, just owning a home isn't really covered by this. Look at like the equipment for that.
Well, we can chalk these up to editing flubs, I guess, and carry on with our lives. But anyway, that's the equipment, and then there's a last piece of God-Machine fiction that brings the stories full circle. Pretty freaky. I think I liked the second one best, but this one was pretty good too. And that's the rules update in all of its 104-page glory. What more needs to be said?
One thing needs to be said. Several times throughout this, I have made references to how the later Splat books have treated this. Audience members should know that we begin with this rules update, and then every second edition book reprints the core rules. Instead of calling you back to the New World of Darkness first edition book and the rules update, or telling you to look at the Chronicles of Darkness book that eventually came out, you need to look at the book itself for its take on the rules. Unfortunately, this reintroduces the possibility of discrepancies. Like, how does a certain merit work? Because it'll like reference conditions or merits that are not in the book and tell you to go back to Chronicles. Or they'll use verbiage that doesn't make sense for that game line, or they'll omit rules. And it's not always clear to me where they're drawing from. I think that a lot of the second edition books will pull from either Requiem second edition or Chronicles second edition rather than the rules update. But it becomes a copy of an update to a book from over a decade ago. And that introduces just enough ambiguity and lost text that you are going to sometimes be blindsided by rules questions and strange phrasing. It's just going to be part and parcel of playing it. The games still do function despite that, but you need to be aware that this did happen when you read those books.
Yeah. That being said, though, I do think this was a solid update.
Oh, yeah.
The overall edition change. Like, it's different enough that it feels like a separate edition, but it's still the same game and the same foundation for other games. We didn't talk much about how the Chronicles of Darkness core book updates storytelling advice, which surely will come up when we do an episode on storytelling tips, but the approaches are rather different to that as well. So, like, my kind of final overall question is, what would you say is the biggest difference between first and second edition in terms of how they present the setting and how to handle it? Like, if you had to boil it down to a single thing.
The biggest difference to me is that the World of Darkness in second edition is more vividly pregnant with the supernatural.
Okay. Like, my thought was that second edition feels more focused on characters and delegating stories to the offshoot games and individual chronicles more than kind of the foundation in the core book. Like, we lose a lot of the first edition core book's narrative fluff and emphasis on themes and moods, maybe because first edition had to stand on its own as a game before all the other ones came out, whereas second edition, they already kind of had a lot to work with. And I don't know that one is better or worse. Maybe what I want to say is that both have useful techniques for players and storytellers alike. So obviously use the rule set of the edition you're playing, but the contrast between the way I feel about each, I don't know, I appreciate having that to compare.
I do wish they had kept a lot more of the fiction from the first edition book, because I think that is very useful.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the biggest difference is, and we didn't really cover it here because it was beside the point, that with the introduction of the God-Machine as an occult kind of background radiation to the world of darkness, the addition of horrors as a concept directly into the Chronicles second edition core book, And the idea most emphatically present in Breaking Points about how everybody's had a brush with the supernatural. Oh, and the greater emphasis upon supernatural merits. It's just a more occult world.
Yeah. Well, it's an occult world and we're living in it.
This was a pretty thorough and entertaining read. I had a lot of fun with this one.
Huzzah! Well, speaking of being thorough, I'm about to be thorough with telling people about if they want to continue this conversation with us. If you have thoughts and feelings about this, though, not like about anything, you can reach out to us on Discord at discord.me/CTP. Send us an email at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. Reach out to us on Facebook or YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. We have a Mastodon, changelingpod at dice.camp, and our Patreon is patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of which will be in the show notes to this episode. And with that, I have been the horror known as Puka.
And I'm whichever edition of Fetch you like the best.
We got through this whole episode. I mean, the listeners, you got through this too, so take a beat. Take 5 beats. Have a whole experience point and make the most of it. Because if you don't, the God-Machine will. She lives.
She lives.
The biomechanical modifications imposed by the God-Machine may be soul-sapping horror shows, but that doesn't mean they can't be fashion. Some of the latest swag to emerge from its unholy clockwork maw include an arm that can punch through steel plate while constantly whispering lines from low-budget softcore porn with the mouth in its palm, wings formed from 1,000 used and rusted razor blades, and an orifice of unclear purpose that changes color at will, currently sweeping the youth culture in Harajuku. We're not ones to judge, but we do recommend that before installing any cursed apparatus into your meat flesh, consult with a doctor or your local partially lobotomized cult leader. And if you'd like to get ahead on the next drop, our patrons get priority in the waiting line for each release, as well as a shout-out at the end of each episode. They include Bad Company, Ben the Canadian, Sig Lawson Jr., Derek, Dorcadus, Elleris, Henry Kraft, Ia Bull, Oreo, Raz Caboose, Rebecca P., Sandjigger, Sija, The Crew of Erebus, and Ware Buffalo. Making use of this plastinated tendon pole dripping with machine oil, we extend our heartfelt thanks to them. You too can sign up at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast and or leave a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. Until next time, when a mysterious trench-coated stranger on the corner asks, "Hey kid, you ever snorted God-Machine?" you say, "Sorry pal, I've got other monstrosities with which to get down," and politely excuse yourself to go keep on dreaming.